I would like to invite Mr. Zaril Kir Johari for the opening speech.
Thank you. Yang berbahagia Datuk Dr. Farouk Musa, good friend from Penang and now chairman of the IRF. Our distinguished speaker, who's now quite a familiar face, having been to Malaysia a few times, Mr. Mustafa Akil. The panelists today, Wan Saiful, and of course Dr. Mazli, all the distinguished guests here today. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good morning. Firstly, on behalf of the Penang Institute, I think it's a real pleasure once again to be involved with the IRF and all the other institutions such as Ideas in organizing this weekend's activities. Of course, today we're here to listen to Mr. Mustafa Akil speaking again on his pet topic of Islam and be it political or economic or even social liberalism, is human agency. The capacity for human beings, individuals, acting rationally to make choices that are deemed to be in their best interest. And to be sure, freedom of choice and conscience alone is insufficient if it is not complemented by the necessary space, both in the private sphere and in the public realm, to act upon those choices without this refers to the lack of such fundamental freedoms. And so an illiberal polity is therefore one that where diversity is not tolerated and where being different invites persecution, both from society and also from the state. It is also one where conformity is not only approved of, and taqlid is expected. In an illiberal state, speech and expression are censored and dissent is suppressed. In most cases, citizens are kept in check through the fear of an existential threat, usually through the construction of an other. Such states also exhibit authoritarian tendencies where rule of law means rule of the regime, and in such conditions, corruption, rent-seeking, and abuse of power usually thrive. And worst of all, and I quote here an American public intellectual, illiberalism is not just about government denying people the right of free expression and equality before the law, it is also about controlling how people think and behave. So if we were to apply all the criteria that I mentioned earlier, I think it's very difficult to deny that Malaysia is anything but an illiberal state. And while often hailed as a leading moderate Muslim nation, in truth, Malaysians walk around with a leash fastened around our necks, and occasionally tugged at, but generally loose enough that is for the most part unnoticeable. The last 2 decades, I think we have seen this leash tightening and tightening. And that's how it has come to be that in Malaysia today, being a Muslim means that one has to adhere to a certain denomination defined by the state. Anything else and one would risk being labeled a deviant. And if telling people what they are allowed to believe in is bad enough, Muslims in Malaysia also are prevented from reading a whole list of publications, ranging from Ultraman to Charles Darwin. Because according to the wisdom of Jakim, these writings may compromise our faith. But if non-Muslims feel left out, don't, because you're also banned from using words like Allah and Masjid, and so there's discrimination for both. It is also in our supposedly moderate country that you often hear of cases of body snatching by religious authorities, and where private spaces are frequently infringed upon by badge-carrying moral police. I think Wan Saiful can tell us a bit more about that. having experienced it terribly himself. The state's attempt to exert control over religion has become so dogmatically extreme that recently there was a case where it expended so much resources into prosecuting that Muslim lady who worked at Borders, and her only crime was being a manager of a bookstore that happened to sell a book that was banned. And the best part is, of course, the book wasn't officially banned yet when they raided the store, and yet she was prosecuted. And when the High Court obviously threw out the case, the government actually appealed. So they're spending public resources on things like this, persecution of people. And so we see now that the leash that I mentioned on our necks have been tightened so much that oxygen flow to the brain, I think, has been affected. Because if you observe the extent of popular discourse of Islam in the country these days, I mean, we don't get great philosophical debates. What we get is questions like, apakah hukum menghantar SMS kepada boyfriend aku? What is the ruling on sending a text message to my boyfriend, for example, for Mustafa's benefit. But essentially, these are the discourse that you hear, the revolving on the mundane and the inane, the dumbing down of popular discourse in Islam. But perhaps more sinister is the increasing lines of division that are being drawn between the Muslims and non-Muslims. And to say that the state is going overboard, I think is really an understatement. When we have recently KPDN-KK, the Ministry for Domestic Trade, Consumerism and Cooperatives, recently announcing that the government intends to introduce grocery apartheid through the segregation of halal and non-halal trolleys. Perhaps the air that we breathe will also be segregated in the near future. And even worse is when creeping Islamization makes its way to the realm of non-Muslims as well, such as in the case of Indira Gandhi, the mother who has been separated for almost 7 years now from her daughter because her ex-husband unilaterally converted their child as a baby to Islam and obtained a custody from the Sharia court. But even though the High Court ruled that and gave full custody to the mother, the police refused to act because they said there is a contradictory ruling or order from the Sharia courts. So thus, what happened to the idea of Sharia laws not infringing upon non-Muslim rights? Here we have a clear, obviously, problem. And so when citizens of a country are divided and discriminated against on the basis of their identity, whether racial or religious, a state is not only illiberal, but is also dysfunctional. And even worse, on a more philosophical level, the illiberal Islamic experience in Malaysia only serves to condemn the religion. Instead of being the promised Rahmatul lil Alameen, the faith of liberation and advancement, Islam here is increasingly portrayed as a doctrine of enslavement, of control and intolerance. And is this not antithetical to the concept of da'wah? We're supposed to make Islam look good, right? Not scare everyone away. But the truth is that Muslims in Malaysia are indeed under threat. But the enemy is not Christians. The enemy isn't the Jews or the West or Orientalism or neo-imperialism. The real threat to Islam in Malaysia is the rise of illiberalism. And as much as we like to lay the blame on colonial legacy and foreign conspiracies, the reality is that these illiberal visions of Islam that is being propagated by the state, this does the most harm to our faith. And so, of course, the big question is, what do we do? How do we face this threat? Of course, I'm not going to go into much detail. After all, you all came to listen to them, not me. But I think suffice to say that two things that we need to do. Firstly is we need to understand and deconstruct this source of illiberalism. And I think if we scratch enough, that we'll find at the root of it is actually political hegemony and regime survival. I mean, there is a real link there. And if you chart and you see the trend of illiberalism when the state became even more and more illiberal, that you would also see it coincides with the electoral fortunes of the ruling regime. And secondly, I think, and also perhaps even more importantly, in order to defeat this problem or menace of illiberalism, I think the legitimacy of the illiberal regime has to be challenged. Tariq Ramadan, when he was in Penang almost 4 years ago, he said that a nation is not only represented in its laws, but also in its narrative. And in Malaysia, as we all know, we have laws that are applied with double standards and a narrative that actually divides the people. So I think this needs to be challenged, this big meta-narrative of our country, our national identity. We cannot have a national narrative that divides the people, that creates two separate identities for Malaysians, where Bumiputras, non-Bumiputras, Muslims, non-Muslims. So what we need is to construct a new narrative, such as was done in Tunisia, where now pluralism, gender equality, and freedom of conscience have become pillars of the new Tunisian state post-Arab Spring. So I think these are perhaps the values that we need to return to in order to save, I think, all of us from this the rule of tyranny and illiberalism. So I'm sure all our speakers here will be able to expand on these ideas here today. Thank you very much once again for coming and supporting our event. I think the turnout here is quite fantastic, better than usual. So thank you very much for coming. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.